More examples before we go on to another subject. Lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. And I want you to look at two men with me today, a little later, who set an example of resisting sinful pleasure, Joseph and Moses. But first, I want to continue one more thought about drinking we started last week. Proverbs 21 says, wine is a mocker and strong drink is raging, and whosoever to see thereby is not wise. This poem I might have read, I can't remember. I'm going to read it again because it is so good. Drinking is positively negative. We drank for joy and became miserable. We drank for sociability and became obnoxious. We drank for friendship and became enemies. We drank to help us sleep and awaken exhausted. We drank to gain strength and it made us weaker. We drank for exhilaration and ended up depressed. We drank for medical reasons and ended up with health problems. We drank to calm us down and ended up with the shakes. I think about a man who came and talked to me one time about things and generally and some about the Lord. He had so much liquor in his body, his hands were just shaking. We drank to get more confidence and became afraid. We drank to make conversation flow more easily and words came out slurred and incoherent. We drank to diminish our problems and saw them multiply. We drank to feel heavenly and ended up feeling like hell. That poem is worth hearing every day or two. In a lot of our society, 64% of our people drink beer. And then up around a half of the people, our boys and girls, I understand, or we studied last week about adultery, have already had relations with the opposite sex before they marry. We need some teaching about morals, friends, in America, don't we? I plan on studying the series, The Works of the Flesh, Galatians 5, 19 through 21, 17 in the King James Version. And then, of course, the 9 fruits of the Spirit also. Today I want to look with you at two great men in the Bible who loved God more than sinful pleasures. They showed us we can resist. One of those was Moses, Hebrews 11, verse 23. By faith, Moses, this is his parents' faith now, by the way, Jochebed and Amram, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandments. Back in Exodus 2, the king had commanded that the little boy Israelite babies be drowned in the Nile River. Commanded the midwives to take their lives, but they didn't want to do it, and they told them the Hebrew women are more lively than the Egyptians are, so they have babies before we can even get here. Of course, they were slaves, they worked hard, they were strong. But that's not always the reason for having a baby, is it, by the way. I've lived long to know about wives and daughters and some of their health things that cause them not to have a baby real easily, but that's not on another subject. Not anything to do really with the spiritual things here. But by faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He gave up position and power right there. He chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. He chose affliction and suffering over, as a part of the people of God, over enjoying the pleasures of sin, which only last a little while for a season. They don't last forever. They're just a little while on this earth and they're over with. And so another reason why we need to be a child of God and put Him first and don't get involved in sinful pleasures. Lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. I'm afraid a lot of folks do that. Moses would not do that. He had an opportunity, had he stayed on as Pharaoh's daughter, to have been certainly a governor and maybe the Pharaoh of Egypt. So one scholar I read said he could have been the Pharaoh of Egypt, even though he's an adopted son. But he also gave up not only position and prestige and power, but he gave up pleasures of sin, which have been so available to an authority. I mean, you know, the women, the wine, the song, the partying, and whatever. In verse 26, he also gave up treasure, money. We studied that 2 weeks ago, the love of money. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure in Egypt. Treasures, plural, in Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. He had respect to the return again of the reward. He knew he was going to get more back for serving God than he would by serving the devil and staying over there in Egypt and being the big man of power in the most powerful nation in the world at that time. Moses lived about 1500 BC. He chose to take the side of God's people, those slaves, those Hebrew slaves, his kinfolks. I'm sure his mother, who was by the providential hand of God, called to in Exodus 2 to take care of him. I'm sure that she taught him about God those years that she nursed him and took care of him for the Pharaoh's daughter who found him in the little basket they put him in the Nile River in. And by the hand of God and Miriam, his sister, asked him, if you want me to get a Hebrew lady to nurse him, I will. She went and got Moses, her mother, his mother. And she took the child and nursed it, and it grew. And then he brought it to Pharaoh's daughter. She brought it to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. He spent then the rest of his 40 years there in Pharaoh's house as one of the sons of Pharaoh, so to speak, an adopted one, even though he was a Hebrew, an Israelite. His mother done such a good job of telling him about God's people, Abraham's descendants, Isaac and Jacob and so on, that he was supposed to lead them out someday. By prophecy, I think God let him know. But she had told him that this is where Christ is going to come to the world, the Christ, the anointed one, the prophet, priest, and king, the Messiah, through Abraham, through our seed. And he had a sympathy for these slaves, his kinfolks. And he went out there and he saw a Hebrew, an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, and Moses must have been a mighty man physically. It says he smote him, and he looked both ways, no one was watching. He buried him in the sand. He killed that fellow, I guess, with his hands. I don't know what he hit him with. But he was a stout man, Moses was. Next day he went out and two of his Hebrew brethren were arguing among themselves, and one was unjustly fighting the other one, and he said, basically told him, why do you smite your fellow? They said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? You intend to kill us as you did that Egyptian? Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. So he said he had to get out of there. Pharaoh heard about Moses killing the Egyptian the day before and realized this Hebrew baby had now grown into manhood as in the palace and knowing all the things of the palace. But he turned on the side of the Hebrews. And so Moses had to run for his life. And he went out in the wilderness of Midian. He saw 7 daughters of Jethro trying to get water for their flocks at this well, or to troughs rather. And some shepherds came in and they're there, and they tried to run those girls off and get first place with their flocks. But Moses was such a man of God, and the providential power of God maybe, he ran those shepherds off and let those girls and drew water for their flocks to drink. They went home and told Daddy about what a good Egyptian they met. He's active as a Hebrew. They didn't know it. He said, why didn't you invite him to come home with you? They went back and got him, and Moses was content to dwell there with Jethro, Reuel, and he ended up giving Moses his daughter Zipporah for his wife, and he had 2 sons by her. First 40 years he was in the king's palace. Riches, honor, splendor, power, whatever he could have wanted. But he was a man of God. His mother taught him right, just like Joseph. We'll look a second. Daddy taught him right. He never forgot it. He never forgot those 2. Boys and girls, I challenge you, if you've been taught the Bible by your mother and daddy, don't forget the scriptures. I don't care what some fuzzy-headed professor in college tells you, you believe the Bible, not man, okay, if there's a conflict. Moses then, after 40 years in the wilderness as a cowboy, as a shepherd, as a man working in the farm life for his dad-in-law, taking care of sheep. Think about that. Leaving a king's palace, could have been the next king, so to speak, maybe. Certainly could have been a leader, a prince. Now out working as a farmhand. God blessed him. He toughened him up to get him ready for that great task of leading Israel out away from Egypt and through that old hard wilderness for 40 years. Next 40 years he spent there with his wife and family and his dad-in-law and worked as a cowman, or a sheep man. Then God called him and sent him to go lead Israel out, and he did with a lot of effort and much help from God. After the 10 plagues, he led them out in the wilderness. If they'd only had faith, they'd gone in the promised land in 2 or 3 weeks. The weak people listened to the weak spies and ended up staying in the wilderness 40 years, and their descendants went into the promised land. Moses had taken advantage of all of those things, prestige, power, sinful pleasures, and plenty of money. He gave up the treasures in Egypt for the benefits of being a child of God. He counted being a child of God, the reproach of Christ, greater treasures than the riches of Egypt, or the greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. Why? He knew in the final analysis he would get heaven for his home forever. And that's more valuable than having a little more money on earth and going to hell for eternity as a lost man. He took the right side. Now Joseph, time won't permit much. Joseph, sold by his brothers, jealous older 10 brothers, sold him to the Ishmaelites passing that way. They were so jealous. Let the poor daddy think he was dead for all those 22 years. He was 17 years old when they sold him. For 22 years he was over in Egypt, a teenage boy. And he never forgot what his daddy taught him. He stayed true to God and his way. because he lived such a godly life. As a slave boy working for Potiphar, he put him over his whole house. He was such a goodly person. He was such a good man. The Lord prospered him. And Pharaoh had a wife. Well, I don't know her name there. I read in Adam Clark's commentary recently about the name that they think she wore, something Zelika or something, I can't remember. Supposed to have been extremely beautiful, but also the handsomeness of Joseph, that Hebrew slave, working for them and taking care of Potiphar and her house, was well known according to history. He was extremely handsome. I won't tell you, read Adam Clark's commentary to see the funny little story he told about, supposedly. I doubt it actually happened. But here it says he was a goodly person and well favored. That meant, according to the NIV, he was well built and handsome, which I don't go with the NIV much, but also other scriptures, other translations tell he was well built. He was strong. He was a good man, a handsome man, Joseph. And he did not let, in this study here, and I'm going to run out of time before I get to finish, even close to it. Pharaoh's wife thought he was so good looking, she wanted him to lie with her, she said in verse 7. He refused. He said, my master don't even know what's going on in his house. How can I sin against my master? He said, he's not kept anything back from me but you. You're his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? You're his wife. I'd be sinning against God too if I did this with you. Day after day she begged him when he'd come in to do his work to lie by her. He refused. I've told schoolboys and girls the story. I've told a boy one time who'd been caught with a girl in adultery. Well, what do you want me to do, Mr. Jester? I said, son, you could have done like Joseph did. You could have resisted her, said, I'm not going to do it. He had to run out. She had a hold of his coat, left it in her hands. Time's about up. He showed you could live right. Sinful pleasures, not important as serving God. Time is up.
And watch the fleeting changes of life's uneven ways. But if my Savior called me to that sweet home on high, I'll live with him.
Selected. Focus. Selected. Screen